The morning my wife told the judge I had contributed nothing to our marriage, I was sitting 3 feet away from her and I didn't say a word. I watched her attorney lay out 32 years of my life like items at a yard sale. Every piece marked down, every piece made to look worthless. My wife sat with her hands folded in her lap, and she nodded along like she was listening to someone read a grocery list. Not once did she look at me. The judge was a woman in her late 50s, gray hair pulled back tight, reading glasses low on her nose. She had the kind of face that had heard every version of every story. She let the attorney finish. Then she looked down at the folder in front of her and she said very quietly, "Counsel, before we continue, does your client know what her husband does for a living?" The attorney paused. My wife turned her head slightly, like she'd heard something that didn't quite make sense. The judge looked up. That was the moment everything shifted. But to understand why, you'd have to go back to the beginning. You'd have to understand what kind of man I was before that courtroom, and what kind of marriage I'd been living inside for more than 3 decades. I grew up in a small town in western Pennsylvania. My father worked maintenance for the county. My mother kept the books for a hardware store on Main Street. We weren't poor, but we weren't comfortable either. What we had, we earned. What we spent, we thought about first. I enlisted at 18. Spent 4 years in the Army, came home, used the GI Bill to get a degree in accounting. Then I spent the next several years working for the federal government. First as an auditor for a regional office. Then, after I passed a series of examinations that I don't talk about much, I moved into a different kind of work. Financial investigations. Fraud. The kind of money that disappears and leaves no fingerprints. I was good at it. Not because I was ambitious. I'm not particularly. I was good at it because I'm patient, and because I understand how people lie to themselves before they lie to anyone else. You see enough numbers that don't add up, you start to recognize the shape of deception before the details even matter. I met my wife at a friend's 4th of July cookout. She was 26. I was 29. She laughed at something I said, I can't even remember what, and that was that. We were married 11 months later. She was bright and social, and she could talk to anyone. I was quieter. I came home from work and I didn't want to talk about work because I couldn't. The nature of what I did required discretion. She knew I worked for the federal government. She knew I traveled sometimes. She knew the pay was steady and the benefits were good. Beyond that, the details weren't something I could share, and for the first several years, she didn't push. We had 2 children, my son and my daughter. My daughter is the older one. By the time they were both in school, we had a house, 2 cars, a mortgage we managed, and what looked from the outside like a solid, unremarkable life. What was happening on the inside was harder to name. My wife had started gradually to manage more of the household decisions. Not in a dramatic way at first. Just, she handled the bills, she handled the social calendar, she handled the kids' schooling and the repairs and the family vacations. I worked long hours. I traveled. I was glad someone was holding things together. I told myself it was a fair division of labor. What I didn't notice, or told myself I didn't notice, was the way the balance kept shifting. By the time our kids were teenagers, my wife had taken on a part-time real estate job. She was good at it. She had the personality for it. And as her income grew, something else grew with it. A kind of confidence that began to have edges. She'd make decisions without consulting me and explain later, if she explained at all. She'd dismiss my opinions at dinner in front of the kids. Small things, then less small things. She started introducing me at her work events as her husband, who works for the government, with a tone that made it sound like I filed forms somewhere. Not dismissive exactly, but not the way you'd introduce someone you respected either. I didn't correct her. I told myself it didn't matter. I told myself the marriage was stable. The kids were okay. We had a good life on paper. I told myself silence was a form of peace. I was wrong about that. Silence isn't peace. It's just postponement. My mother had been living alone since my father passed. She was in her mid-80s by then, sharp still, but slowing down. She lived about 40 minutes from us. I visited when I could. My wife visited less often, and when she did, it was usually brief. They were polite to each other, not warm. About 3 years ago, my wife started volunteering to help my mother with things, running errands, taking her to appointments. I was relieved. I thought it meant something had softened between them. I was traveling more that year. There was a case I was working that I can't describe in detail, but it kept me away from home more than usual. Having my wife involved with my mother felt like a weight lifted. I should have looked more carefully at what was being lifted. It was my daughter who first said something. She called me on a Sunday afternoon, and I could tell from the first word she was choosing them carefully. "Dad," she said, "have you looked at Grandma's accounts lately?" I hadn't. I told myself my mother was competent. I told myself I trusted my wife. I told myself a lot of things. I was helping Grandma with her filing last week, my daughter said, and I saw some transfers I didn't understand. A few of them are pretty significant. I drove to my mother's house that Tuesday. My mother, to her credit, seemed more embarrassed than distressed. She showed me the statements. She explained quietly that my wife had said she'd help consolidate some accounts, simplify things, make it easier to manage. Nearly $40,000 had moved over 16 months, some of it to an account my wife controlled, some of it in cash withdrawals my mother couldn't fully account for. I sat at my mother's kitchen table for a long time after that. I didn't say much. I drank my coffee. I looked at the papers, and I started to understand that I had been patient for the wrong reasons for a very long time. I didn't confront my wife that night. I didn't confront her that week. What I did instead was what I've been trained to do. I started building a record. Within 60 days, I had documentation of everything. The transfers, the timing, the accounts. I also had documentation of something else I'd found while looking. My wife had taken out a home equity line of credit on our house without my knowledge, using a forged signature on the application. The amount was $63,000. Most of it was gone. I went to see an attorney, a good one, not the kind who advertises on bus benches. My attorney asked me what I wanted to do. I told him I wanted to do it right, and I wanted to do it once. That means being patient a little longer, he said. I told him that wasn't a problem. My wife filed for divorce 4 months later. She had apparently reached a point where she felt the position was advantageous for her. She had her own attorney, a man who was loud and thorough and clearly accustomed to winning by volume. Her filing made several claims that I had been emotionally unavailable throughout the marriage, that I had withheld financial information from her, that she had been the primary caretaker of the family while I was absent for work, that she deserved the majority of our shared assets, including the house, on the basis of her contributions. I read through all of it, and I didn't feel angry, exactly. I felt something closer to recognition. This was the shape of the deception I had seen coming, just written in legal language. My son called me when he heard about the divorce. He was not kind. He had been living near his mother and had been hearing her version of things for months, it seemed. He told me he always knew I hadn't been present. He told me she'd had to hold the family together while I disappeared into my work. He told me he wasn't sure he could support my side of this. I listened. I didn't argue. I said I loved him and that I hoped he'd give me a chance to show him the full picture when the time came. He hung up before I finished the sentence. My daughter was different. She'd seen the bank statements. She knew what she'd found. She stayed close to me through all of it, and I will never be able to tell her what that meant. The first hearing was a procedural one. Attorneys talking about scheduling and assets, and who was going to provide what documentation by when. I sat at the table on my side of the room, and I watched my wife across the aisle. She looked confident. She had dressed carefully. She did not look at me. Her attorney was doing most of the talking. At one point, he described my career as vague government employment and said that I had been deliberately opaque about my finances throughout the marriage, implying that I was hiding assets. My attorney glanced at me. I nodded slightly. He said nothing yet. That afternoon, my attorney filed a motion requesting that the full scope of my federal employment records be reviewed by the court under seal if necessary to accurately characterize my income and assets. He also filed the documentation we had assembled regarding the transfers from my mother's accounts and the home equity application with the forged signature. 2 weeks later, we were back in court. This time it was a fuller session. My wife's attorney laid out her case. He was thorough. He talked about her years of sacrifice. He talked about her real estate career. He talked about the emotional labor she had carried. At several points, he referenced my absence and my secrecy as evidence of a man who had never truly been a partner. Then he looked at me and said that I had been, at best, a passive presence in my own family, and at worst, a man who had used his professional opacity as a shield to avoid accountability. My wife nodded at that, slowly, with conviction. The judge let him finish. Then she looked down at the folder in front of her. She said, "Counsel, before we continue, does your client know what her husband does for a living?" The attorney blinked. "He works for the federal government." "Some kind of. I'm going to need you to read Section 3 of the file that was submitted to this court last week," the judge said. She wasn't unkind about it. She was simply precise. "Take a moment." There was a pause. My wife's attorney picked up the documents. He read. The room was very quiet. My wife leaned over and whispered something to him. He held up one finger without looking at her. He kept reading. When he looked up, his expression had changed. Not dramatically, just recalibrated. Like a man who has walked confidently into a room and realized it is not the room he thought it was. For the past 22 years, I had been a senior investigator with a federal financial crimes unit. My clearance level, which the judge now had documentation of, explained why my work had never been discussed openly. I had spent 2 decades investigating large-scale financial fraud, the kind that crosses state lines, sometimes national borders, sometimes involves institutions that don't like having their names in courtrooms. My salary was not modest. The pension I had accrued was not modest. The assets in my name, which had been characterized in my wife's filing as suspicious and hidden, were in fact well documented, properly reported, and accounted for in records that simply required the right clearance to access. My wife's face, when her attorney turned to explain this to her, did something I hadn't seen it do in a long time. It went blank, not angry, not calculated. Just the floor had shifted and she hadn't seen it coming and she did not know, in that moment, which way to step. Her attorney asked for a brief recess. The judge granted 5 minutes. In the hallway, I could hear my wife's voice, not the words, just the pitch, high and fast and not composed. When we came back in, the shape of the day had changed entirely. My attorney then presented the documentation regarding my mother's accounts, the transfers, the timeline, the equity line, the signature comparison, which had been done by a forensic documents examiner, someone I'd found through professional contacts, and which concluded with a high degree of certainty that the signature on the application was not mine. The judge asked my wife's attorney if his client wished to respond. He said they would need time to review the materials. The judge said they would have it and set the next date. The next 3 months were not easy. There were depositions. There were additional filings. My wife, through her attorney, attempted to characterize the transfers from my mother's accounts as loans that had been mutually agreed upon. My mother, who is 86 years old and remembers everything with perfect clarity when she wants to, gave a written statement that used the word agreement exactly 0 times. My son came to see me in that period. He drove up on a Saturday morning and sat at my kitchen table and didn't say much for the first few minutes. I made coffee. I put the folder of documents on the table and I didn't push him. I just let him look. He looked for a long time. "I didn't know," he said finally. "I know," I said. "She told me you'd been moving money around and hiding it. She told me you'd never really been there for us. She told me." He stopped. His jaw was tight. "She said you'd been lying to us for years about what you did and who you were." "Some of that is partially true," I said. "I couldn't tell you the specifics of my work. That wasn't a choice I made. It was a condition of the work itself. Why didn't you ever tell me more, even in general?" "Because the habit of discretion runs deep," I said. "And because I thought what I did at home was enough to show you who I was." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I should have asked more questions." I told him he didn't need to apologize. I meant it. The final session was quieter than I expected. My wife's attorney had done what good attorneys do when the ground shifts. He'd adjusted strategy. There was less volume, more concession. The attempts to characterize me as secretive and financially evasive had been quietly set aside once the court had reviewed my federal records. The settlement reflected the actual record of our marriage. I retained the house. The retirement accounts were divided by what each of us had actually contributed. The home equity funds, the ones taken without my knowledge, were accounted for in the settlement calculation, as was the money that had moved out of my mother's accounts. My wife received what a 32-year marriage entitled her to under the law, not more. She did not look at me when we left. I drove home alone, stopped at a gas station for coffee because I hadn't eaten much that day, sat in the parking lot for a while. The sky was doing something nice, that late afternoon light that makes ordinary things look like they mean something. I thought about the years of silence, the dinners where I hadn't spoken up, the events where I'd stood quietly while she introduced me as something vague and small, the nights I'd come home to a house where my presence felt mostly administrative. I wasn't angry about those years anymore. I was just done carrying them. My daughter called that evening. I told her how it had gone. She cried a little, and I told her not to because things had come out the way they were supposed to. She asked how I was. "Tired," I said. "But okay. Did you eat?" "Gas station coffee counts," I said. She laughed. It sounded like her grandmother's laugh. Like my mother's laugh. I hadn't noticed that before. My mother is doing well. She's back to managing her own accounts, with my daughter checking in regularly. She doesn't talk much about what happened with my wife. My mother has always been economical with her judgments. What she says instead, when it comes up, is, "Paper remembers, even when people don't." She's right about that. It always comes down to the paper. My son and I are finding our way back to each other. It's slow. There are things he believed for a long time that take time to unbelieve. I understand that. I'm patient by nature, and I have no interest in forcing it. What I know is that he showed up on that Saturday morning and sat down at my table, and that matters more than I can say. I retired 8 months after the divorce was finalized. 31 years of service. There was a small ceremony, the kind that happens in conference rooms, not auditoriums, a few handshakes, a plaque. My supervisor, who I had worked under for nearly 2 decades, said I was one of the most methodical investigators he'd known. He meant it as a compliment. I live in the same house. I kept it, not out of stubbornness, but because I built things in this house. Planted things, fixed things. I know every corner of it. Some mornings I sit on the back porch with coffee, and I think about the things I should have said sooner, the moments I chose silence when I should have chosen words. I think about my wife standing in that courtroom, confident and composed, and the look on her face when the floor moved. I don't take pleasure in it. I want to be honest about that. The person I was in that courtroom, the one who waited, who built a record, who let the documentation speak, that person wasn't acting out of revenge. He was acting out of something older and quieter, something that just needed the right moment. What I know now at 63 years old is this: patience is only a virtue when it's pointed at something worth waiting for. I was patient for 32 years in the wrong direction. Then I turned it around, the paper remembers. And eventually, so does everyone else.